I'm chairing. My name's Elizabeth Stockdale. I'm Head of Farming Systems and Agronomy Research at NIAB. And that's about as much, apart from me pointing and conducting, that you're going to hear from me today, which is a good thing. I've got two great people with me that are going to introduce themselves. And first, Tom.
Hi, I'm Tom MacMillan. I work at the Royal Agricultural University and also help coordinate the Agricultural Universities Council, which brings together the universities that research and teach in agriculture, and we're co-sponsoring this study with Agricology.
Great. Yeah, I'm Julia Cooper. I'm head of research at the Organic Research Centre. And yeah, I'm going to kick off this session today. I'm going to give a little bit of a talk on some work that I've been involved in the last 6 months or so with the Organic Research Centre on looking at research priorities for Regen Ag. So I'm going to talk for hopefully only about 12 minutes or so, and then Tom, and then we'll have time for questions. So really hoping to hear from people during this session on what you think about some of the priorities we've pulled out of our research in the last year or so, and hopefully we'll have some good discussion at the end. So yeah, this is an intro to the project that we've been working on at Organic Research Centre with Liz Stockdale in collaboration. She said she wasn't going to say anything else, but she may jump in on the questions if there's anything she wants to contribute, and Belinda Clark at Agritech-E. And this came out of an interest that was expressed by the Sainsbury's family and their charitable trusts that you can see the three of them named there that funded this work. You know, they do a lot of funding for research in plant science, and they wanted to know more about what are the needs for Regen Ag, what do we need to be researching to really, you know, shift the dial, move, sort of facilitate the transition to more regenerative farming systems in the UK, particularly around crop science, soil science, plant science. So we sort of set to work on trying to understand that through this work that we've been doing. First of all, why do more research? So there might be, you know, some people in the audience that say, oh, for goodness sakes, you researchers have had lots of money already. Why do we need to do more research? Here are the 5 principles of Regen Ag that have been beautifully illustrated there by the Groundswell team, and we all know them. So don't we already know what we need to do? Shouldn't we just get out there and do it, right? But I don't know if anyone in the room can notice there's a 6th principle that sometimes it's not included in this diagram, but it is often mentioned in Regen Ag circles. What's the 6th one that's missing there? Anyone know? Context, right, well done. Sorry, I had reverted there a little bit to my lecturer. Sorry, I'll go back to my non-lecturer. So yeah, context. So it's all about applying those. These are great overarching principles. How do you apply those in our local context? And Regen Ag is really context specific, right? You know, when you start to remove inputs, you really then, the environmental factors, conditions on your farm really become more and more important. So we do need to do research in our local context. So what about, isn't this just good old-fashioned mixed farming? Maybe we can just look at how we used to farm locally and you know, just carry on with that. We don't need the research. Well, I guess I would argue, and most of us would argue, that definitely there's been a lot of research in the past that is applicable, right? Around, before we even knew or used that word, Regen Ag. And we definitely need to look at that and build on that. But we've also got lots of new research methods, techniques, and there's new innovations available out there in the farming sector. So we do need to look at some of these and how they might support the transition. So that's kind of how we justify that we probably do need to do more research around Regen Ag. So this project was about identifying where are the gaps in knowledge. It wasn't about actually finding out the answers to all these topics I'm going to put out in a minute, but just where have we put more effort in the past? Where do we need more effort? So it's about, what we did was we set out, first of all, to get a list of all the priorities around Regen Ag and how to transition to Regen Ag based on talking to farmers and stakeholders, running a workshop, etc. Then we reviewed existing evidence around those priorities. So we looked at past projects, we looked at peer-reviewed research, old DEFRA reports, and based on that, we just came up with the gaps. Basically, if you've got an important research topic or challenge, and there hasn't been much research in the UK or much projects in the past, so there's a bit of a gap there, then that should be a top priority for us to maybe be focusing in on. So that was sort of our process, how we kind of ranked these different topics. So we came up with about 34 different topics, sometimes we call them challenges, in these different theme areas, 6 different types of challenge or types of topic that we thought would be important to address to help transition to Regen Ag. And you can see them grouped there. I won't read through them all, but things like advice and guidance, how to do things, soil health, a big one, breeding, etc. So we went through that process that I mentioned of looking at the evidence that's out there, and we sort of reviewed that and talked to stakeholders at a workshop and tried to kind of decide which of these were higher priorities, et cetera. And we've just come out with a report, isn't yet publicly available. It sort of talks about all 34 and the status of research and where we think some of the gaps are, and also how those questions could be addressed. So I'm going to do a quick run through. I don't know how much time I got left. Probably rambled on. How am I doing? Am I right? Okay. So here's some examples. Okay, so impact of Regen Ag on farm livelihoods. I think it's really interesting. I kind of find that reassuring, really, that through all of our research and discussions, this came out as really the top one, particularly at the workshop. Basically, you know, how do you make it work economically on a farm? We need more evidence from real farm situations who have implemented Regen Ag on how it's affecting their bottom line. There aren't that many studies or projects right now that have been looking at that in the UK. I've put a few up there on the screen that I think are really useful. Things like Fix Our Food, which is UK Transforming the Food Systems project up in Yorkshire. There's Ruth Wade, who has a field experiment looking at regen systems. A lot of NIAB trials, like the STAR trial there, will provide lots of useful agronomic information on yields. And also they provide economic sort of analysis of margins and stuff. So that's useful too. And you've got AHDB, strategic farms, monitor farms. So there's that sort of stuff going on. We need to probably consolidate that and sort of synthesize some of that information and build on that. So we need more sort of applied research knowledge exchange around that question. Regional adaptation of cover crops. So this is one that comes up again and again. This comes back to that context issue, and I always get kind of fired up about that because I come from North America, and I know if you take a cover cropping system that works in North America and try and do it here, it's a very different climate. So we need to look at systems as well as the actual varieties of and species of cover crops that are going to work in UK rotations and systems, knowing we've got sort of cool, wet, temperate climates. We don't have, it's hot now, but it takes, you know, it's quite late in the summer actually relative to the North America to get that hot weather that's going to maybe make it, you know, make your cover crop mature that you could roll or crimp it. It's probably a bit late. So those systems that are used in other parts of the world maybe aren't appropriate here. Not really many peer-reviewed studies. Bit of historical literature, so we can go back to some studies back even in the 90s on things like cover crops in the UK and make sure we build on that. I wanted to highlight the cover crop guide. You can see there bottom left, that was a real farmer-led initiative. Angus Gowthorpe up in Yorkshire got funding with Yorkshire Agricultural Society to produce this online resource that's really fantastic. I don't know if any of you have seen it yet. I believe AHDB is going to take that sort of within there, sort of as part of their sort of materials to maintain going forward. So lots of good practical information in that. We've got projects like NIAB's Centre for High Carbon Capture Cropping, where they are looking at cover cropping. So there is some stuff going on, so we need to build on that. In terms of the actual varieties, yeah, look at what the existing crop varieties are for among the cover crops and work with the seed companies to basically sort of really select and identify those cover crops that are suited for our systems. Variety evaluation, breeding for low N and pesticides. So that's one that comes up again and again, that the varieties we're using haven't been selected for regen systems. This is just one set of traits. There's other traits that came up in the review as well that there's a lot of interest in breeding for. So there are projects out there, things like this NIAB project, exploiting novel wheat genotypes, very relevant. There'll be a lot to learn from that. And we have our own ORC project, live seeding, where we trial modern wheat varieties compared to blends and heterogeneous populations in organic systems. So really under sort of a high kind of selection pressure for weed pressure and also low nitrogen and pesticides. So there are projects like that going on. This really links with the recent AHDB recommended list review. So this was also identified in that review of their of the sector as something of interest. And they've done a scoping study recently that definitely I think would be the first point of call to build on that if we're going to go forward and start to look at variety evaluation for these sorts of traits. Intercropping is one of my favorites because if you go into the peer-reviewed literature, which is an academic I love to do, hundreds of papers out there globally on how to intercrop. You know, it's something, it's not new, it's been going on around the world for years and years. But, and there's also been some really important projects here in the UK. And you'll see some on the screen there. We have people like Andrew Howard, who did a Nuffield on this a few years ago, who did lots of good work finding out what's going on globally and around and in the UK. We had this Diversify project, which was an ORC project where they developed some tools, but more sort of applicable to European situations that could be adapted. Innovative Farmers projects. And then you've got this leguminose, which I noticed actually, I think on the program here at Groundswell, I think there's something on leguminose. I don't know if anyone here knows this later this afternoon. So there is some stuff going on. We need more field trials with farmers, developing some practical recommendations and regional demonstrations, that sort of thing. So that's another one that's quite high on the list. And oh, I also should mention, yeah, the bottom left, that's a soil association project, and they're part of Leguminose, which is also a University Reading project. So I'd certainly go to the Leguminose sort of group, first of all, to find out where they think the next steps are in research. And now here's a bit of a tricky one around soil health, this real tricky question around the pros and cons of what we call strategic tillage. So as an organic farmer, as organic farmers are often sort of criticized for using the plow from time to time. I think many of them are really trying to reduce their use of tillage, but once in a while will want to go in and till. Likewise, conventional farmers, especially if they can't use glyphosate in future, may want to occasionally till. So what are the negative effects of that, what we call strategic tillage, relative to continuing no till at all, but using glyphosate, where there's a lot of concerns about that. So there's some stuff to unpick around relative effects of tilling occasionally versus glyphosate. There's lots of papers globally on occasional tillage, nothing really done here in the UK. Lots of papers on glyphosate and soil health, but nothing really sort of looking at the trade-offs. I think there's a bit of work to do around that. Here's a couple of projects that may start to look at that. So again, Ruth's project, Fix Our Food. Also, the project, Jonathan Storkey's long-term trial at Rothamsted Research, where they're comparing quite systematically regen versus sort of more conventional practices, may help us to start to unpick these questions. Let's see. Oh, I think I'm almost done. Am I on time? Good. Okay, yeah. So basically some of my thoughts really. There is a lot of extensive background knowledge on many of these challenges. I'm really not a fan of reinventing the wheel. I think there's been a lot of work done. So part of the benefit, I think, of this project we've just done is we've really tried to compile sort of a database of all those projects on all these areas that have happened in the past, so that we can kind of then look at that before we go forward in planning new projects. So, you know, working groups around some of these priority areas to build strategies to sort of formulate new programs, I think, are what's needed. And yeah, so we can build on that information in the past projects. And yeah, also working across these challenges and multidisciplinary methods are also really important. So I think that's everything I'm going to say for now. I'm going to hand over to Tom.
Okay, thanks. May I have the clicker? Thank you. Great. So I'm going to share what we found in a complementary piece of work to this, which is look at it from the other end in a way, and looking at farmer research priorities. So when you ask farmers what they want research on, what you want research on as farmers in the audience as well, what comes up, and so what's on people's minds. And as we've done a recent sort of snapshot of that with the NFU, Innovate UK, and a whole lot of other groups involved as well. So that's what I'm going to share. And what prompted it to start with from our end was a joint research strategy that we put together for the agricultural universities. I mentioned this group of agricultural universities that get together as the Agricultural Universities Council, and part of that's about seeing, you know, where many hands can make light work, and we can team up and do things together that we'd otherwise be you know, duplicating effort on. And so part of that was looking at where our research effort goes at the moment, and thinking about, you know, are there ways we could target that better at things that are going to be more useful and relevant on the ground. we resolved out of that process to do a whole bunch of things, including training researchers to focus more on systems, but also to work more effectively with farmers on the ground. But we also had quite an emphasis on a more open priority setting, more open research priority setting. And so that was a prompt for this. And behind that was we did lots of survey work and things, and we found that farmers, but also researchers, felt that UK agricultural research was, fantastic, world class, and all that, but also poorly communicated, poorly coordinated, and out of touch with what farmers were needing on the ground. So that was the drive for this piece of work. Ultimately, we need, I think, probably much more sort of long-term structural ways of building farmers' voices continuously into the ways that particularly funders and research providers, universities, institutes, and so on, decide what to do and focus on. We don't have that at the UK level. In Scotland, there's Safari, which does a little bit of that pretty effectively, but at a UK level, that doesn't really happen so systematically. And this, what I'm sharing now, is not a long-term, we're not pretending this sort of addresses that problem once and for all. It's a quick snapshot in the spirit of cracking on and doing something that's better than just leaving it alone. So that's the backstory to it. Is this? Yep, there we go. So last time anybody had done something much like this was back in 2013, where many of the same people, so the NFU, AIC, Innovate, then the Technology Strategy Board, I think it was called, produced this Feeding the Future report, and that took an approach of talking to lots of groups of farmers and then pulling their priorities together and presenting those back to the funders and research providers, and it proved quite influential. So it helped shape the Agritech strategy that year, which was a big spend on big investment by government in agriculture, which I'm sure lots of people have mixed feelings about it, but this piece of work already made it better than it would have been. And then it also shaped the Transforming Food Production Programme, which was the next sort of big wave of investment from government. So it proved quite an influential exercise. And we decided with NFU, with that same group, and Innovate UK, who'd been involved in 2013, but also to bring in a more diverse range of farmers groups as well, so farmer networks, so Land Workers Alliance and Innovative Farmers, Innovation for Agriculture. So we tried to sort of broaden out the range of systems that would be represented in this process to do a bit of a repeat of that. So we held 12 farmer workshops, which were run by this group of different farmer networks with their own community, so the Agritech centres as well, did some of that. And like I mentioned, Land Workers Alliance, Innovative Farmers, and so on too, and AIC. So a real mix of farming systems. Some ran multiple groups, some just had one session. 92 farmers and growers were involved in the process, and then you can see the commissioning group and the funders there as well. All the groups then used a standard format to kind of pull together the lists of priorities that people came up with in those groups, and we tried to do a pretty cheap and cheerful version of this and see how far we get using ChatGPT to do the thematic analysis. So like put a whole lot in there, see what came out, and actually worked a bit, but not as well as we hoped. And so my colleague Kaylee at the back there, who's done much of this work, then went and manually ran through and sort of coded all the priorities that came through against lots of different other sets of priorities, which I'll talk through in a moment. So she did a lion's share of the work, and it was a huge amount of work in the end because the ChatGPT didn't come through. And the operating principles wanted to keep it simple, kind of not have us do it all in the centre, but let the groups of farmers and those networks kind of run their own show. Like I say, be more inclusive of different systems and previous exercises, and also if in some cases, like in horticulture, which we didn't go into in a huge amount of depth in this, there's been a lot of thought already about research priorities. So again, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel and get everybody to say again things they felt they'd said many times before. So we allowed a flexible approach to it, and then you can see here the sorts of things that we got from each group, and then we processed, and the way we then tried to make sense of what came through was to take those themes that farmers were suggesting, so lots of specific things, and then group them, and then map those against what other people were saying the research ought to be on. So we took the work that Julia's just talked about now on regen research priorities, and we said, well, how does what we're hearing from farmers map onto those themes that Julia pulled out? We also looked at the priorities that funders at BBSRC, the main research funders of agriculture in the UK, what they said the priorities were. We looked at the Agri-Food for Net Zero network, which has a stand over there, which is a big group of researchers working on agriculture and net zero, and they'd just gone through a process of thinking about research priorities. So we looked at how these ideas from farmers mapped onto what that group of researchers said was important. So we're trying to look at it in a way sort of from the ground up, and then at the other end of the telescope, if you like, other people sort of taking strategic views on what they thought was important and seeing what matched up, what didn't. And then the final one on the left there is the Agriculture Universities Council review of strategy that I mentioned, where we looked through where not what people thought ought to be happening, but what research was actually going on. And so again, we compared what farmers wanted with what research was happening. So you can't read that, don't worry about that. I'll talk through roughly what's going on here. So across the dozen workshops, farmers suggested 800-ish priorities, ideas, challenges, needs, and lots of specifics. And when we put this out in a few weeks' time, you'll be able to browse through and sort of go into all the detail on every specific idea that came up through that process. Some of them are fleshed out and expansive ideas. Some of them are one-word suggestions. So they'll all be there. But I just want to focus today on the main patterns. So here at the top of the list, so the stuff with big bars is where there were lots of suggestions. The things with only a few, where there were very few suggestions. And top of the list were points about how research gets done, actually. So not what to research on, but about the adoption of ideas, about farmer-led innovation, about future skills, changing skills around farming. Then you get into a bunch of things around disease detection, nutrient management, breeding, digital tools, and so forth. Then you get into soil health, not that far down the list, and not much further, actually. You get into things that are specifically about regenerative agriculture. And so that's regen as a kind of topic in its own right. When we mapped as I mentioned, the priorities that came through those 800 against the themes in Julia's report that she just ran through now, a slightly earlier version, so there's only 5 here rather than 6. But so we mapped them across those themes, and you can see down the left-hand side there are those themes, so how-to at the top, and crop genetics and farm behaviour and so forth. What we saw was about just over half of the things that had come through in this process we could match up with one of those themes. So a bit under half didn't really fit anything to do with regen, and so there were suggestions around. So at the right here is things where more suggestions came through under those themes within the sort of clusters we grouped them in. So people were interested in the impact of regenerative systems on the environment, in under soils, in indicators of soil biology, soil health. On the farmer behaviour side of things, like what's stopping people doing more of this was part of the interest, and research into that. Breeding for disease and insect tolerance, and then on the how-to side of it, a lot of thinking about really research into how to change your system, integrate livestock back in, and also on cover crops, like Julia mentioned. So good, in a way, quite a good fit with the themes that Julia was highlighting. And then what this one shows is, so we haven't named these groups because we thought that was a bit unfair, but what it shows is the different networks. So some of the groups like NFU ran a whole bunch of workshops, and some other networks just ran one workshop. This is by which network convened the workshops, and in the turquoise is the things that came up that weren't about regenerative agriculture. And what this shows is basically all the groups across the board, whatever systems they're working with, whoever was there, they all were pretty interested in regen. Some of them very interested in it, some of them less so, but it wasn't like it was one or two groups that sort of usual suspects, if you like, talking about this. It was across the board, and that was interesting as well. We also looked at what had changed since that 2013 report. So it's been quite a long 10 years in a way since then. So we looked at under the themes back from 2013, what had kind of gone up and what had gone down, and some of the things. So this isn't all the themes from there, but there was a big theme around precision ag back in 2013. Still very much on people's minds, but quite a different shift. So there was stuff back then on animal health and handling perishability. The things that were on people's minds under that theme now were more about data ownership and connectivity and those sorts of things on ecosystem services and so on, which is a big theme back then. Interested in back then in plant genetics and for breeding for greenhouse gas mitigation and so on. Now much more focus on sort of wider landscape features and hedgerows and sort of getting out of the field in that area. On the social science, it was about how do you, back then it was about, in a way, anticipating elms and the design of these systems, which ones work, which ones don't. Now, again, sort of more expansive view perhaps on ways to incentivize farmers to deliver public goods beyond what's now familiar in terms of elms, and kind of what farmers' relationships with the wider public as well. And on training, back then a big focus on demonstration and sort of demo farms and so on. Now much more on farmer involvement in research. So sort of taking out of even demo farms out there everywhere, and also on farmer wellbeing, much bigger theme. I mentioned the Agri-Food for Net Zero Network Plus there. So in a way, just briefly on that, quite a good fit with some of the big themes around food security and so on that were identified in that process, where farmers weren't suggesting so much around circular food systems, so things like waste valorization, behaviour change, public behaviour change, and healthy and sustainable diets, which isn't really a surprise because those things are several steps removed from what farmers might be dealing with every day. But obviously, in the sort of medium term, have massive effects on the future of farming and the viability of different production systems and so on. Comparing with funder priorities, so these are the headings that the BBSRC has identified, so the main research council funding agricultural research has identified as particularly important. And here, there's a bit of a mixed fit, so lots on what they've grouped as sustainable agri-systems, and a bit on crop and animal health and precision. And then genomics, a very big focus for the BBSRC, less of a theme, present, but not such a big theme for farmers. And then the other things on reducing waste and food safety and nutrition, same applies as what I said a moment ago. And the final thing I'm going to share that we compared with, this is, again, hard to see, but there's some big patterns here to mention. What we did here was the yellow, which is lots of yellow on the left and not very much yellow on the right. That is mapping basically where the research is happening, looking back where it has been happening across the universities as a whole sector. And the way we did that was we took the 3,000 publications that, as a group of universities, we'd put into the last big review of what we're all up to, which is called the REF. And we went and looked at what those were all about, and then we counted how many of them were about different topics. And then in the orange is doing the same, but for the 800 or so current PhDs that are going on in agriculture across the country. So we did those, and we grouped them under themes. And then in the red are, under the same headings, the farmer research priorities from this process. And so what we've done is saying, are people doing research where farmers want research? And the answer is a little bit sometimes. So here, the areas where most of the research effort has been going have very little interest from farmers. So that's because they're basic science, basic plant science, basic science that actually is several steps removed from farming, but that's where the majority of the published research effort is going. Then you've got a set of things where there's a reasonably good fit, and so that's on applied livestock research, applied plant science, and also I can't quite read it for myself from here, and also sort of applied ecosystem environmental science as well. So good fit there. Lots of interest from farmers, quite a lot of research going on, and then you've got the things where farmers want a lot in this process at least, and where there's not much going on. So soil science, where there's a bit going on, but not that much. Agritech, which, as a group of universities, we talk quite a lot about agritech. We don't do that much, actually, relative to the amount we talk about it. And then social science, where huge interest from the farmers, and things are about the sort of how-to, the behaviour, and so on, what works, and much less going on. So just to wrap up, interest across the board, across the groups of farmers in Regen. No huge surprises in how things have shifted since 2013, but there have been some small shifts. There is this mismatch between where the money and the research effort goes and what farmers seem to be saying they would like. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's always that the farmers are always right and the researchers are wrong, but there's definitely a mismatch, and that's part of the benefit of this sort of process, to have those discussions about what's important. And then we're going to put all this online, so as well as the big themes which I've run through now, you'll be able to go in and look at the detail, whether you're a farmer, but also thinking particularly about researchers and research funders, and kind of delve into that. So thanks very much.
Thank you, guys. I think that was a really good introduction and should set us up for having a potentially interesting conversation. You can shout at them because they've missed something out. You can challenge them on their interpretation. You can do whatever you like. This is your bit of the session. There is a roving mic. We do want you to use it so that the questions are captured. Can you also please introduce yourself before you ask a question? Again, so that we might understand perhaps some context or background. That's really important to us. Basically, put your hands up. The roving mic will find you, and it will just literally seek you out. I'm not in control, so I'm not going to point. It's in control, and when you have it, please feel free. And it's probably just easier for me if you stand up, because that means I can see you, if you're happy to do that with the roving mic and speak. No, you don't do nothing at all.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Tom. Nice to see you. Hi. That was super interesting. Thank you so much. Lots to talk about with you afterwards. I just want to ask, where in this is it in here, the kind of the hard science of what the world really needs versus then farmers' priorities based on what they're seeing, researchers, funders, etc. Is that kind of in the funders and other priorities? Where do we sort of match it, all of that, against what we've actually got to achieve in a time frame?
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'll let him answer and think about it, but I need you to introduce yourself.
Sorry, I'm Geraldine. I'm Geraldine Gilbert from Forum for the Future.
Thank you.
Do you want to? Yeah. So in a way, this is one ingredient, and into that kind of thought process. And my take on it is, what would be useful would be a bit like what happens in Scotland through the Safari network, which is every few years the research institutes and Scottish Government as a main national research funder get together and sort of have a proper think about what might be useful to spend money on, where the research capacity is needed, and so on. And that involves kind of all the elements. So this kind of stuff where you're going and talking to farmers and other people involved in doing things about what they'd find useful, what's on their plates, what ideas they have, where they need backup, and so on. But also doing this sort of, that the big picture stuff of saying, where's the world heading? What is this enough? And looking at it from, at least both those dimensions, and probably other things as well, and doing that together. So you don't have, it's not all about sometimes the way that research funding works is it's almost sort of fire and forget. So people come up with this idea of, well, let's have some research on this topic, and then put it out there and hope that a competitive process will deliver the optimal way to solve that problem, and generally it doesn't. So we all run around and don't necessarily use our energy as effectively as we could collectively. So I think something like that, where it's deliberate, planned, regular, strategic look at what's important. You don't necessarily end up with it being perfect, but it's much better than the way we do things at the moment at the UK level. So I think that's what we need, and this is, like I say, one ingredient, not the whole answer.
So Julia's going to comment, but can you wave if you want to ask the next question? Because then the microphone will find you as Julia talks.
Yeah, I think, like as Tom's explained, your research was very much about farmer priorities, what was coming from there, and it was really reassuring to us. And they just by chance, these two projects were happening in parallel, but that your priorities map quite well onto what we came up with priorities, which was not just from farmers, but also talking to scientists. I forgot to mention when I was talking about what we did, as well as running a workshop with some stakeholders, there was also a great conference held in Cambridge in March that was called The Future of Farming, where we had all kinds of people from all, range of sectors, non-governmental, farmers, scientists, all kinds of people together, kind of really brainstorming again on these ideas of what we need to do really to shift the dial. So and so you need to bring a lot of voices into the room really, but we've tried to do that with these two processes, I think, but there's still more work to do for sure. Yeah.
Hi, Richard Winspear from RSPB. Sorry, I'm here. When you were asking farmers about their challenges and needs, did you present them with a list to rank, which might have made it easier to prioritise the priorities, or did you actually allow them a free choice, which might have given you the greater breadth of their priorities and needs?
So the free choice, but with some prompts, and part of the prompts were more about thinking far ahead, and sort of getting out of what's on my mind this morning, kind of thing, which is often where a conversation like that would start, and trying to help the conversations focus on 10 years and more ahead. And so it's more that kind of prompt rather than saying which of these 5 things that I think are important do you think are more important, most important. So yeah, that was the idea. But it's you could have a process where you took a whole bunch of priorities that other people had put lots of thought into and said rank these and what have we missed. So but we didn't do it that way this time.
Yeah, and we did it more the way you're describing. I mean, we did sort of very rapidly talk to various kind of key informants in the sector and came up with a list. And then we ran a workshop with some stakeholders, and they sort of ranked and prioritized them, but they also told us the ones they thought that we'd missed. So we added to that list. So it was a bit of an iterative process. So I'm fairly confident that by now the various people that have inputted into our list, I'm fairly confident we haven't missed something obvious.
I guess the thing to comment from our perspective from that study was we were focused on plant science and soils. Yeah. So there are probably more detailed livestock topics that probably aren't showing up in that presentation we've given you. That isn't because we don't think livestock are important, but just because the way that work was funded and focused was more on that plant science, forage crops, but feeding through. You had the broader focus on all farming systems, but yeah. Please.
Hi.
Cool.
My name is Joy Skipper. I'm a registered nutritionist. We've talked about what the farmers' needs are. From a nutritionist point of view, we obviously need nutrition for the general public. Are there many research papers or any studies going on that look at that from the other side, really?
It actually came up as it is one of the topics. I think it's in 2 different places on our list. Awesome. One of them around this topic of nutritional quality or nutrient density, which is quite a trendy sort of phrase to use these days. So there are, so that's something to look at. There, I mean, probably could be too long of an answer, but Regen Ag. First of all, how do you do a study when it's not very clearly defined? That becomes a bit tricky. There's been a lot on organic food, comparing organic and conventional. There's a lot out there on that, but on regen systems, not so much. So that might be considered a gap. But another place where that sort of quality of the product came up was also how it might affect the wider food system in terms of changing, the final fate of a given product. So if you have a product that isn't lower quality necessarily, but let's say you have a grain that's lower in protein, a wheat that's lower in protein, would no longer be used for maybe in the bread market, might need to go into the feed market. What are the knock-on effects of that? So that did come up as something important, more from the researchers, and that's all around food systems, kind of really looking at food systems stuff, and that transforming UK food systems top call that you mentioned, those projects that are kind of getting to the end now, we're supposed to be addressing some of those questions. And so some of them have started to look at that, but I'm sure there's more to look at in that topic area for sure.
Hi, is this working? Yeah, hi, I'm Rob Booth from the British Ecological Society. I appreciate that the presentations were a very small encapsulation of the project, but I was wondering if maybe the discussion of climate change or extreme weather was missing a little bit. I wonder if you could reflect on how that kind of non-linear potential change will mediate how we do research in this kind of space, and if that at all sort of was involved in how you're conceptualizing these future trajectories for research. Thank you.
So, and you're talking there about, as in climate change, sort of more on the adaptation side than on the mitigation side, yeah. And there is quite a lot. There's quite a lot going on around that. Thinking about future crops and so on. There's some quite big projects trying to explore that already. In terms of where in the piece of work I mentioned, it didn't come up that much from the conversations with farmers as a big theme. And that agri-food for net zero network I mentioned, within there, it's part of the mix, although that's more focused on mitigation. But it's also, you can't, it's sort of it's the changing scenery in a way. It's like there's the moving backdrop to the whole thing. So it features within there, and obviously we did that exercise of looking where the overlap was. But yeah, it didn't come through as a huge theme from farmers.
Yeah, I think from our from our workshop, some of those questions, and we've kind of grouped them under what we call wider system considerations. They might fall under that. So, for instance, impacts on water cycle of Regen Ag. So it doesn't explicitly say climate adaptation, but the idea that regenerative systems might be more resilient in future extreme weather, whether it's drought or excess moisture. So that came up, and then questions around more climate change mitigation. So the questions around emissions are there as well, and relative emissions from different systems. And then if you look at the how-to bits, crop rotation designs in there, and to me that's sort of again linked. How do you design rotations for future, being resilient in future, future extreme climates. So it's in there, but not so explicit. You're right. It's not so explicit.
Yeah, and also sorry because you've sort of reminded me. I think actually there was quite a bit in there around resilience, and particularly around drought and so on. So it was there, and also when you're talking about regen, I think it is part of the overall sort of narrative and story. It's part of the framing assumption is not only about reducing impact and improving profitability and so on, but also about resilience and adaptation and herbal lays, for example, deep rooting and how they do in drought, and all those things are part of the whole premise almost. So I think they filter in there too.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Ruth Wade from the University of Leeds. Thank you so much for the shout out about our work that we're doing at the University of Leeds. I just wanted to also make a comment that as a researcher, in the last year, I put in several grants applications for research that is farmer-led, co-designed questions that they want to ask, and it doesn't get funded. So I think there's another conversation to have, and also another side to your work that you've done where we are trying, but then it doesn't get funded. So that's really difficult. And then the other question I just had for Julia, amazing work, and I really love that you've summarised some of the research that's going on. Is there future planning to continue this, of the research that's going to be carrying on in the future, and how do we keep track of that, and how does it carry on forwards? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Ruth. Yeah. I mean, we built a database of sort of all these projects, going back to the 90s, sometimes from DEFRA, that are relevant, we think. So that's sort of, they are static right now, but it'd be great if it could be maintained and kept live and also sort of hosted somewhere. So we're sort of at the moment just thinking about what the next steps are really with that work. And I forget, was there another? About the funding for farmer-led yeah, challenging. I think that goes back. Maybe you have something to say about.
Can I just comment on the Farming Innovation Programme will have a new big round of funding coming in the autumn, which is going to be called Adopt, which is specifically focused on farmers, particularly working in collaboration, developing and enabling research up to £400,000. So a significant investment per project and quite a lot of millions. Now, this is farmers' own money. Let's be clear, in the Farming Innovation Programme, this is the repurposing of basic payment money. So farmers really working with researchers such as Ruth and others as facilitators. This will be a really brilliant opportunity, I think, to bring many of these things into action over the next year, year and a half, 2 years, really to step change the way we think about how we do this sort of research. And I think if it goes well, Tom, we'll have a really good case to keep doing research in that sort of way as part of a standard programme.
I'm just going to put in a pitch now. I'm allowed to do a
Yeah,
pitch.
go on.
A pitch for there's a conference coming up this autumn that's co-hosted by Organic Research Centre, Land Workers Alliance, and the AAB. It's called Cultivating Wisdom, and it is all about farmer-led, farmer sort of collaborative participatory research activities. So we're trying to bring together farmers and researchers in equal number to get together and talk about how they've worked together on what's worked for them in these farmer-led research approaches. And I think, Philip, there's flyers around that you can just put that in your diary. It's in October, and we're looking for people to come along, and hopefully that'll be a really useful event.
Cool. So I've got one there, and I'm going to finish here, if that's okay.
Hi there, Anthony Pearce from North Shropshire Farming Regenerative League there. I'm a historian, and I'm very aware of the wealth of documentary evidence there is about 18th century and 19th century farming practices, and I'm wondering whether there are people out there plundering this wealth of evidence for the benefit of informing the regenerative farming practices.
I think the answer is probably not well enough, but certainly people like me keep going, well, the Romans did work on grazing wheat to manage disease coming into the spring and so on. So actually this looking at what worked well in the past with the lens of thinking that through with a scientific framework and what we know now can actually generate really good new knowledge to be tested then in new systems. And I think that's it's a really good shout, and something that I think what we've got lazy is where things have been digitized and we go, yeah, we'll search the literature. And what we mean is we'll go back and look at what was published in the stuff that we can see digitally, not the stuff that we have to actually go to libraries and read and look properly, even at farm records and all sorts of things. I think there's a really good field there, really good opportunities. And it would be great, I think, for many of us, I think, to find those opportunities to take that forward.
I'm Claire Birch. I'm a trustee of Aurora Trust, and I'm also a farmer. And I happen to do my dissertation as a geographer on 18th century farming in Lincolnshire, so very long time ago. I was really interested, Tom, that you didn't have, given the fact that regenerative farming is struggling, they've only got either heritage grains or they're working with grains that have basically been designed to work in high input systems. I was surprised that research into crop varieties wasn't higher up on the list of interest for farmers.
Yeah, I think it was in there, but as you say, maybe not as high as you might expect. I think and it's quite a big theme in your piece of work, the suitable varieties for regenerative and agricultural systems. I think it's and it's on people's minds. Yeah, I mean it didn't come through as a huge thing, and maybe that also reflects that. Variety is only sort of part of the equation in a way, and we have in UK agricultural science, we've had this huge focus on crop varieties and breeding, and that being the main thing. And so while it is hugely important, it's also quite refreshing to have the breadth of other. Yeah. No, sure, but I think it's also quite refreshing to have the the attention on all the other things that matter as well to do with farm management and so on. And so yeah, I agree, it's important.
But I think you may have maybe spotted when I was flying through, AHDB did a bit of a survey of their levy payers around the recommended list trials and what they wanted to see, and some of those questions have come up and I've totally forgotten. One of them was on reduced nitrogen And then was this other on pesticides? NIAB's done the scoping, been involved in those scoping studies. Is those two topics they've done? Yeah. So they have been looking at whether there's a need, and that's the big question, and sometimes differences of opinion among the scientists and the farmers on whether you need sort of new separate breeding programs, or whether the breeding programs that select for the best varieties under high nitrogen will also select the best under low. And that's the big kind of holy grail is that still is yet to be resolved, really. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there is some work evaluating a whole range of varieties going back into the 40s to the modern varieties, barley and wheat particularly. I think the bigger challenge actually, and that is in Julia's report, is actually for things that aren't those main cereals, is for potatoes, is for how do those other crops, and including minor cereals and svelts and so on, might the and it's variety evaluation, not only breeding, but how is that process of looking at that whole range of genetic resources looked at and built ideally, I think, into diverse crops, not into single monocrops. And that also is a challenge, but one that's a huge challenge for all of us. So 2 minutes to go. What I want a quick sense of is, did they get it about right, or are they missing really key things? And the way you're going to tell me this is, because I've given you a couple of minutes, is if you think they're missing really key things, you need to come and tell them. So before you let them leave the stage, come and tell them. So that the number of people coming forward to go, but my thing's not on there. And actually, it's really important that if you've thought that you do that. But otherwise, thank you for your attention, for your reflection, and for most of you, for your participation in these processes to date, and your continued engagement with us to think about what kind of research would really help you in future, so that we can do, as scientists, the best research to enable regen farming systems to deliver the food and environmental outcomes that we need. Thank you very much.